December 26, 1996. In one of America's wealthiest small cities, a 6-year-old girl vanishes inside her own home. Hours later, she is found dead in the basement. The note left behind promises a kidnapping. The evidence suggests something darker. Nearly 3 decades later, the question hangs over Boulder: what really happened to JonBenét Ramsey? More than 21,000 tips, over 1,000 interviews, outside expert panels, and DNA reviews have produced no charge. Yet the case is not frozen in the past. New interviews, new evidence, and fresh forensic testing have kept it alive. Tonight, we enter the house again. Christmas had just passed in Boulder, Colorado, and the Ramsey home still glowed with the afterimage of celebration: pine needles, wrapping paper, ornaments, the fragile illusion of safety. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the foothills dark, the winter air sharp enough to make every sound feel exposed. Inside that house lived a family that seemed to embody American success: wealth, beauty, ambition, pageants, parties, polished photographs. And before the next day was over, that image would shatter into one of the most haunting mysteries in modern American crime. At dawn on December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey called 911. Her daughter, JonBenét, was gone. In the house was a ransom note, strange, theatrical, unnervingly long. It demanded money in a specific amount, claimed the child had been taken, and warned the family not to contact police. But this was not a distant abduction. Hours later, JonBenét Ramsey, 6 years old, was found dead inside the house itself. A child reported kidnapped had never truly left the building. From that moment on, the case stopped being a local tragedy and became a national fixation. The facts were horrifying enough. The contradictions made them unforgettable. A ransom note in a murder case. No simple sign of forced entry that settled the question. A crime scene inside an affluent family home during the most intimate holiday of the year. A victim whose image, pageant crown, bright smile, staged makeup, would be replayed across television screens until she became less a child in the public imagination than a symbol, a spectacle, a cultural obsession. America did not simply witness this case. America consumed it. And yet beneath the noise was something investigators could never escape. This should have been solvable. The victim was found inside the house. The time window was narrow. The circle around her seemed limited. Cases like this are supposed to collapse inward. Instead, the JonBenét Ramsey case expanded outward, into competing theories, investigative missteps, suspicion aimed at the family, suspicion aimed beyond the family, and a media storm so intense it sometimes seemed to blur the line between evidence and theater. What made the mystery even more enduring was not just what happened in 1996, but what kept happening afterward. The investigation did not disappear into an archive. It grew. Over the years, authorities followed more than 21,000 tips, reviewed nearly 2,500 pieces of evidence, and built a case record so large it reached roughly 1 million pages. Investigators interviewed or spoke with more than 1,000 people across multiple states and beyond the United States. In 2023, Boulder police said a Colorado cold case review team had examined the investigation, and by 2024 and 2025 officials were emphasizing that DNA analysis remained a central focus, that expert recommendations were being worked through, and that new interviews, new evidence collection, and retesting were ongoing. This was not a dead mystery. It was living. That matters, because JonBenét Ramsey has long existed in 2 versions. There is the historical case most people think they know, the child beauty queen, the sensational headlines, the fractured theories, the endless debate over whether the truth lay inside the family or outside it. Then there is the modern case file, digitized, re-examined, filtered through evolving forensic science, revisited by detectives who were not standing in that house in 1996 but are trying to understand what happened there. One version belongs to memory. The other belongs to evidence, and evidence can change its meaning as technology changes. In 2008, the Boulder County District Attorney cleared JonBenét's parents and brother based on DNA results pointing to an unexplained third party, a move that reshaped the public conversation but did not end it. Later debates would question how much those results could truly tell investigators, while police continued to insist the case remained open, active, and dependent on whatever future science might reveal. That tension, between exoneration and uncertainty, between old suspicion and new forensic hope, is one of the reasons the case still feels unfinished, suspended between eras. And maybe that is why this story refuses to fade. Because it is not only about a murder. It is about the collapse of certainty. About how a crime scene can become a mirror reflecting fear, class, media appetite, parental grief, institutional error, and the limits of science all at once. JonBenét's death became a national mystery. But the deeper story is how America built that mystery, fed it, argued over it, and still cannot close it. So before we ask who killed JonBenét Ramsey, we have to ask something even more unsettling. In a case examined for nearly 30 years, with thousands of tips, mountains of evidence, and ever-improving technology, what if the greatest obstacle is not what was hidden, but what was misunderstood from the beginning? To understand why the JonBenét Ramsey case still resists closure, we have to step back into the mechanics of that house, that morning, and that investigation, not as spectators, but as detectives entering a scene already contaminated by panic, grief, and assumptions. Because this case was never just about a single clue. It was about the collision between evidence and interpretation. And once those two begin to separate, truth becomes harder to catch. The first great fracture in the case came from the ransom note. It was not a brief demand scrawled in haste. It was long, oddly theatrical, and written on paper from inside the Ramsey home, apparently with a pen from the house as well. It referenced a specific sum, one tied closely to John Ramsey's business bonus, an eerie detail that made the note feel intimate, informed, almost staged for someone who knew the family. To many observers, that transformed the note from evidence of an intruder into evidence of deception. But even that conclusion opened another problem. If the note was meant to mislead, who exactly was it meant to protect? Then came the house itself. A large home can be deceptive on camera. From the outside, it looks grand but knowable. Inside, it becomes a maze of rooms, stairways, doors, corners, and blind spaces. The basement was not merely a basement. It was a hidden world beneath the holiday decor above, a quieter geography where danger could remain invisible only a floor below family life. That physical layout mattered because it made the crime feel both intimate and impossible. Either someone inside the household knew those spaces well, or someone from outside had moved through them with disturbing confidence. The early response that morning added another layer of complexity. Friends were called to the house. People moved through rooms. The scene did not freeze into a controlled forensic environment. It became, for a time, a human environment, crowded, emotional, unstable. In modern true crime language, this is the moment viewers often describe as the fatal mistake, the original wound in the investigation. Not because it proves who committed the crime, but because it may have blurred what the house was trying to say. In homicide work, a scene is like a language. Disturb it too early, and the grammar of the event begins to dissolve. And yet, even within that uncertainty, investigators saw deeply troubling details. JonBenét had suffered injuries that suggested a sequence more complex than a simple abduction gone wrong. The murder was not easy to categorize. It did not settle neatly into one familiar type of crime. It contained elements of staging, elements of brutality, and elements that seemed designed either to conceal motive or confuse investigators about it. That is one reason the case grew so psychologically charged. People were not only asking who could do this. They were asking what kind of mind would do it this way. Over time, the investigation split into competing universes. In one universe, the answer was close, inside the family orbit, inside the home, inside the emotional architecture of the household. In the other, the answer was external, an intruder, a predator, someone who entered and left behind a crime so bizarre it looked, at first glance, almost too strange to be real. Each theory fed on the weaknesses of the other. The family theory pointed to the ransom note, the setting, the intimacy. The intruder theory pointed to unidentified DNA, possible entry routes, and the fact that public certainty had often outrun proven fact. This is where the case stopped being just an investigation and became a war over interpretation. Television amplified every inconsistency. Books, leaks, interviews, and expert panels turned ambiguity into a permanent public argument. Even the child at the center of it risked disappearing beneath the mythology. JonBenét was no longer only a victim. She became an American symbol, of innocence violated, of media excess, of class suspicion, of the fear that evil can wear either a familiar face or an invisible one. Then forensic science entered the story like a second era. DNA findings complicated the picture and, for many, reshaped it. The possibility of an unknown male profile found in key evidence did not automatically solve the case, but it injected something powerful into a narrative previously dominated by suspicion toward the family. The possibility that the truth might still lie outside what the public had spent years arguing about. That shift mattered not just legally, but psychologically. It reminded investigators and audiences alike that evidence does not care which theory is more famous. But the deeper twist is even more unsettling. What if the JonBenét case has survived so long precisely because it sits at the edge of forensic transition, old enough to have been born in an era before today's investigative standards, yet recent enough for modern science to keep reaching back into it? It belongs to both worlds at once, the analog world of 1996 and the digital forensic world that followed. Every new advance reopens the possibility that the case was never unsolvable, only not yet fully readable. And that is where the mystery grows larger. Because when a case survives decades, it begins to ask a question beyond guilt or innocence. It asks whether time destroys truth, or preserves it in forms only the future can see. If that answer is waiting in a fragment of DNA, a misunderstood movement inside the house, or a clue dismissed when America was too busy watching the spectacle, then the real story may be even darker than the crime itself, that the truth was always there, and we were looking at it without truly seeing it. Nearly 30 years after JonBenét Ramsey was killed, the case stands at the crossroads of memory and technology. It is no longer only a question of what happened inside a house in Boulder in 1996. It is also a question of whether modern science can still reach back through decades of doubt and recover a truth that public obsession and early investigative errors could not secure. Boulder police continue to call the homicide an active priority, and in their 2025 update they said detectives had conducted new interviews, re-interviewed people based on tips, collected new evidence, and tested and retested existing evidence to generate new leads. That matters because time changes cold cases in two opposite ways. It erodes memory, weakens witness certainty, and buries context beneath years of retelling. But it also turns old evidence into new evidence. Biological traces that once seemed too small or too damaged can become newly meaningful as forensic methods evolve. Boulder officials have repeatedly said DNA remains a central focus, that preserved evidence is being prepared for testing when validated methods allow accurate analysis, and that collaboration continues with the FBI, CBI, prosecutors, and outside laboratories. Here the case becomes larger than one family, one city, or one headline. JonBenét Ramsey's murder has become a test of what justice means in the forensic age. Not the television version of justice, where revelation arrives in one dramatic scene, but the slower version, where truth may depend on microscopic material, chain of custody discipline, and the patience to revisit old assumptions. It is a living experiment in whether science can rescue history from distortion. Public pressure around the case has never disappeared. In late 2024, attention surged again when a Netflix documentary brought the investigation back into the spotlight. Police responded by rejecting claims that viable leads or testable evidence were being ignored, while also saying they welcome coverage that may generate new information. That response revealed something important about modern cold cases. Media attention can both damage and assist in investigation. It can create noise, myth, and premature certainty. But it can also shake loose memories, prompt witnesses, and force institutions to keep moving. Yet the deepest implication is more disturbing. What if the case has lasted this long not because it is beyond understanding, but because it sits inside one of the most dangerous zones in criminal investigation, the place where evidence exists, but interpretation fails. The ransom note, the house, the timeline, the early handling of the scene, the years of suspicion, the debates over DNA, the 2008 decision by the district attorney to clear the immediate Ramsey family, and the continuing disagreement over what the evidence truly proves together form a warning. Human beings do not simply solve mysteries. We also manufacture them. That warning reaches far beyond Boulder. Every famous unsolved case becomes a struggle between two kinds of truth. One is evidentiary truth, fragile, technical, incomplete, often silent for years. The other is narrative truth, the version people repeat because it feels emotionally coherent. Narrative truth is faster. It is cleaner. It gives the public villains, motives, and closure before science is ready. But evidentiary truth is slower and often humiliating. It asks us to admit that we may have been certain too soon. The JonBenét case has forced America to live inside that discomfort for decades. And still, the possibility remains that the answer survives. In a preserved sample. In a retested item. In a forgotten tip that suddenly matters because technology has changed the question being asked. Investigators say more than 21,000 tips have been logged and more than 1,000 individuals have been interviewed or spoken with over the life of the case. Those numbers suggest not a mystery abandoned, but a mystery repeatedly entered and carried forward across generations of detectives. So the final meaning of this case may be larger than its resolution. Justice matters. A name matters. The truth about who killed JonBenét Ramsey matters. But the story also confronts us with something universal, how fragile certainty becomes when fear, grief, status, media, and time all gather around a single death. We want to believe that the worst crimes leave obvious answers behind. This case suggests something darker, that truth can remain in the room, in the paper, in the fibers, in the silence, and still evade us for years. Maybe that is why JonBenét Ramsey still haunts the American imagination. Not only because a child was taken from the world in a place that should have protected her, but because the case exposes the limits of our confidence. We build stories to defend ourselves from chaos. Science arrives later, quieter, asking harder questions. And somewhere between those two forces, between what we believed and what the evidence may yet reveal, the real answer still waits. Hidden inside time. After everything we have seen, one truth stands above all others. The JonBenét Ramsey case is not terrifying only because a child was killed inside her own home. It is terrifying because the case sits at the point where evidence, human error, media pressure, and time all collided at once. And nearly 3 decades later, Boulder police still say the homicide investigation remains open and active, with continued interviews, new evidence collection, and DNA-related testing and retesting. The most responsible conclusion is this: the case cannot be honestly reduced to a simple slogan. It is not serious analysis to say, with certainty, it was definitely someone inside the house, and it is not serious analysis to say, with certainty, it was definitely an intruder, because law enforcement has not solved the case and has publicly said more evidence is still needed. What makes this case so enduring is that each major theory explains part of the mystery, but not all of it. The inside-the-house theory feels powerful because the crime happened within an intimate space, the ransom note appears deeply strange, and the setting itself seems to suggest closeness, familiarity, and staging. Emotionally, it feels plausible because people instinctively believe crimes committed in a sealed domestic environment must come from someone already inside that world. The intruder theory remains powerful because the investigation has continued to treat DNA as important. The immediate Ramsey family was publicly cleared by the district attorney in 2008, and police still do not speak as if the question has been conclusively resolved. So the strongest mature position is not false certainty. It is this. The case appears to be one where early interpretation may have hardened faster than the evidence did. And that may be the single biggest reason it still lives. The most compelling hypothesis. If I had to give the strongest documentary-style hypothesis without pretending it is proven, it would be this. JonBenét Ramsey's case became harder to solve because the original crime and the public narrative fused together too quickly. that fusion created 3 layers of distortion. The first was scene distortion. Once a crime scene is emotionally disrupted in the first crucial hours, the event becomes harder to read cleanly. The second was narrative distortion. The case was no longer just investigated by police. It was investigated by television, tabloids, public emotion, and cultural bias. The third was time distortion. Every passing year preserved some evidence, but also buried the original atmosphere of the house, the behavior of witnesses, and the fragile clarity of first impressions. In other words, the case may not have remained unsolved because it lacked clues. It may have remained unsolved because too many clues entered the world already wrapped in competing stories. A darker possibility. There is also a darker implication. What if the true horror of this case is not only the murder itself, but the possibility that the answer has always been near the center, in the note, in the house, in a misunderstood timeline, in a biological trace, in a detail dismissed too early, and the world kept circling around it without fully seeing it? That is what makes the JonBenét case feel almost mythic. Not supernatural. Not impossible. Worse than that. Human. Because human beings are not defeated only by a lack of information. Sometimes we are defeated by too much noise around the information. The biggest lesson from the case. This case teaches a brutal lesson about modern crime. The public loves closure more than truth. Closure is fast. It is emotional. It is satisfying. It gives us an ending we can hold. Truth is slower. It is technical. It is often incomplete. It humiliates people who are loudly certain too soon. That is why this case still matters beyond Boulder, beyond Colorado, beyond true crime itself. It is a warning about what happens when a tragedy becomes a cultural spectacle. The victim risks being buried a second time, beneath commentary, suspicion, reenactment, theory, and performance. So the deeper lesson is not only solve the case. It is also protect the evidence before the story hardens. Separate grief from assumption. Separate theory from proof. Never confuse popularity of an explanation with accuracy of an explanation. Why the story still grips people. People are still drawn to this case because it strikes at several primal fears at once. A child in danger. A home that fails to protect. A wealthy family that cannot buy safety. A crime that seems close, but remains unreachable. A nation that watched, judged, argued, and still does not know. That combination is almost impossible for the human mind to release. We want locked mysteries to open. We want the house to speak. We want one final fact to arrive and reorder everything. And perhaps that is still possible. Boulder police say evolving DNA technology remains part of the effort, and that preserved evidence may be tested again when validated methods can produce accurate results. Final reflection. Because in the end, the JonBenét Ramsey case is not only a mystery about who committed a crime. It is a mystery about how truth survives after chaos. About whether science can outrun rumor. Whether time destroys answers, or preserves them. Whether justice can still arrive after the world has talked for too long. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this. The killer may have needed only one night. But the truth has needed decades just to keep breathing.